What's going on, 3DMJers? Welcome to another episode of the 3DMJ podcast. I am joined by Coach Brad Loomis and the Steve Taylor, Master of Dietetics, dietitian extraordinaire, MSc, RD, great wispy beard and mustache. Not wispy in a bad way, but like the perfect length. Just a great jawline on that guy. That's who I'm joined with today, and I am excited to be talking about a topic specifically that I think is kind of goes under the radar a little bit, and that is that sometimes you'll see people talking about tracking, and I don't think everyone means the same thing when they say tracking in the nutrition world. So, for example, one person might say, yeah, I track my nutrition, and that could mean that they are monitoring what they're doing, writing it down, maybe using an app, maybe tracking their macros, and someone else might say they're tracking or refer to when they were tracking, and they might think of if it fits your macros and the process of actually going to a website, calculating a deficit energy intake or a surplus energy intake, and getting 3 specific numbers, buying a food scale, and then going through the process of trying to hit those numbers to achieve an outcome. And I think sometimes people will also talk about the potential harm of tracking. Or issues with it, how it can create neuroticism, or how in someone with a previous diagnosis of an eating disorder or body image concern that tracking could exacerbate those issues. And there's even data speaking to this to some degree. But I think it's very different to engage in what is essentially behavior modification, trying to hit 3 target numbers with your nutrition, changing what you're doing to achieve an outcome, and simply monitoring what you're currently doing and learning more about your habitual diet. And I think they're actually way more different than we often acknowledge in terms of what it feels like, what the goal is, what the experiential process is like, and why you would do the two. So first off, Steve, what's your take on this? When someone says they're tracking, what often do you think they mean, and what other information do you want to get from them to kind of understand what their baseline behaviors are?
When somebody normally says they're tracking, I normally take that to mean they're tracking their calorie intake or their macronutrient intake, just because I don't really hear of, I think it's a good idea and I have people do it, but I don't really hear of many people just tracking certain behaviors or just tracking their fruit and vegetable fluid and protein intake. I just don't hear that many people do that. So typically, if somebody just says I'm tracking, I take that to mean either calories or macronutrients.
Okay. And Brad, for you, tracking, I think, do you think people in our kind of bodybuilding world see that as one specific thing, or do they have the kind of nuanced understanding that we're going to talk about on this podcast?
I would say most do not have the latter. And I can kind of give a good example of this when I ask people to start tracking their water. And the first response that I get is, okay, coach, how much water do you want me to drink? And I'm like, I don't want a target. I want you to tell me how much water you normally drink, and I want you to track it for me. And I should give bodybuilders a little bit of a break, because that's powerlifters too. You know what I mean? They're thinking that I want them to drink 2 liters of water. I want to make sure they're drinking a gallon of water, whatever. But in actuality, what I want to know, if it's a bodybuilder, I want to know how much water you normally drink so that I can plan peak week appropriately, right? If you're a power lifter, I want to know how much water that you drink if we want to do a water load for maybe cutting a little bit of body weight before a powerlifting meet. So a perfect example of this is I didn't know how much water that I normally drink. And so without changing any behaviors and without having any goal in mind, I simply just went on my little app, and every time that I had any water, 20 ounces, I added it. 24 ounces, I added it. Lo and behold, after about 6 days, my average was about half a gallon. It was about 112 ounces, I think, or something like that. And so therefore, when I did my water load as a test, right, I found out I need to double it, which means I need to drink a gallon. I need to drink about 220 ounces of water in order to get the desired outcome. But I would have not got the outcome hence a drop of, I think I dropped like 1.5 pounds or something like that, which is perfect for what the evidence shows. It's like 1% of body weight. You know what I mean? I wouldn't have known how much to drink unless I had a baseline of behavior of what it is that I normally do through tracking, just monitoring, like you said. So, long way, I'm sorry, of answering your question. But I think that the nuance that you're talking about is oftentimes not understood, and is a different language sometimes for bodybuilders, power lifters, that are oftentimes focused on an outcome.
No, that was a perfect answer, Brad, because it illustrated exactly my point, is that people often jump into changing their behavior before they're even familiar with what it is they're changing. The idea of going into a new plan, setting up a diet without even really being fully aware of what your current diet is, doesn't make a lot of sense when someone actually takes a second and thinks about it. And even if you look at the muscle and strength pyramids and the kind of questions that we've had over the years based upon just the very first level, the energy balance level, there's two different ways where you can calculate your maintenance energy. And there's the preferred way, which is, hey, track for a few weeks and see how your body weight is changing in response to your unmodified diet and energy intake. Or use this calculator and jump right into your diet. And everyone is always wanting to do the latter and has a ton of questions about, well, where should my activity modifier be? That doesn't seem to predict me that well. And the answer is always, again, you're doing the thing I'm saying don't do, but you want to do that. And I understand the reason why. Most of the time that people are starting to learn about nutrition and thinking about hiring a coach or doing this, it's because they have a motivating factor to do that. They have a goal. They're dissatisfied with where they are. So they want to engage in change. But I think just like, we wouldn't want to randomly ascribe you a certain amount of volume to do, or like, hey, how much should I squat today in the gym? You know what? How tall are you? How much do you weigh? Oh, you're male or female? How long you been training? You know what? Put 150 kilos on the bar for your squats, right? Like, what if you happen to be stronger or weaker? Now that could pin you, or that could be way too light, right? The same thing is true of nutrition. So your point is perfect, Brad, to illustrate that if you were to jump right into a water load or a water cut without knowing where you're starting, your water load might be less than your habitual intake, and your water cut could be more than your habitual intake, depending upon how hydrated you normally stay. And that applies to everything. There's pretty large inter-individual variation in energy needs. A related topic is, someone's activity levels, which is going to be a heavy influence on what the energy needs are. There's a lot of variation in NEAT, a lot of variation in just general activity levels, and there's just genetic variation in basal metabolic rate. So people are not easily predicted by these equations. On average, they are, and it works for most people, but there's enough variation outside of that where we need to know not just quantitatively what is my habitual energy needs, but also why do I eat what I eat? How do I feel? How often do I eat? And what is the qualities of that nutrition? There's so much to be learned. So Steve, when you first start working with someone and they might have a goal that would be benefited from tracking, do you have them just jump right into tracking to hit certain targets to reach that goal? Or what does your process look like of kind of onboarding that skill set?
It's interesting. So it's almost always a 2-week minimum of just tracking their current behaviors without giving them any calorie targets. And I've had to change my language over the years because I found out that, like, if people would think, oh, we're not starting yet. Like, this tracking thing, he's just giving me some crap to do while we're like, I've had to be like clearly up front, be like, no, like this, like we're going, like these 2 weeks are really important. Like, because they'll kind of like, I noticed that they would not take it as seriously because they didn't have a calorie goal. And so they thought it was like, oh, it's just we're just kind of doing this little thing until we get going. And so I've had to be like, no, like this is it. Like this is the beginning. Like you're starting now. So it's always a 2-week minimum, at least just tracking their baseline behaviors. And then from there, it just depends on I mean, it can go in any direction of things based on, I mean, most fat loss phases, I have people track their calories, fruits, veggies, and protein. I don't know. There's so many. I'm just thinking of all the ideas that I've done. But like most fat loss phases, it's 2 weeks of like, hey, let's just track behaviors. Then we'll start adding a calorie goal maybe around the beginning of week 3. And then by the end of the fat loss phase, we've tapered away from tracking, but they're still tracking their fruit, vegetable, and protein intake. And that's something that they'll do habitually for indefinitely. So it's like, even if I haven't tracked calories for years, like me personally, and the thing I recommend to my clients is like, still track your fruit, veggie, and protein intake. Because like that is enough accountability to where it's so much easier to just track those things compared to full tracking of like getting in a food tracking app and weighing everything and logging everything. Like it's much less work than that, but it is enough to keep you accountable and help influence your decision making.
Got it. Yeah, I really like that. And I think there is, regardless of whether you decide to jump onto one of these websites and spit out 3 numbers, which you're going to follow, and you download MyFitnessPal for the first time, you buy a digital scale, all this stuff, and you're doing that to hit targets, or whether you're doing it just to monitor, you're going to have a very similar process, right? You're going to be like, oh, how does the tear function work? Why are there 10 entries on MyFitnessPal for oats? Should I be weighing this cooked or uncooked? What if different cooking methods are used? Like, what about the spray or the olive oil? Or like, how much of the fat that is kind of coming off this meat do I count? All of those questions are going to happen either way. And they're viewed very differently psychologically when they're happening while you're trying to achieve a goal versus while you're just trying to learn about tracking. Like, if you're actively trying to get leaner on a week-to-week basis and you have a deadline and you don't know if you're tracking your food right, that's stressful. And you're Googling online, you're probably going to find Steve's article that's great on the 3DMJ website, whether you should, weigh your foods raw or after they're cooked. And you're going to like be trying to look on Reddit, like, hey, which one of these entries on MyFitnessPal is right? Yada, yada, yada. And it's going to be stressful because it is friction to you achieving your goal. However, if you're currently tracking and monitoring your behavior because you just want to get a better understanding of what it is you eat on a day-to-day basis and how do you operate, that is the goal, to learn those things, right? And as soon as you hit go on, I'm trying to lose fat, the goal is accuracy, the goal is outcomes, the goal is let me make sure that I'm doing this perfectly. And when you're unable to do that, it's a mistake, right? I'm doing poorly. I'm not achieving my goal as well as I could be. But if someone says, hey, I want you to learn this skill, you expect to have that friction. You know it's a learning process. And I think the mindset there is quite different. And there's no cost to when you're in this environment of trying to learn things first before you jump into it. And there's a lot more to gain. And I think you're actually in a better position to really be present with and not rush that process. I know that people who are also tracking to achieve a goal kind of put blinders on as well to things that aren't directly relevant to the goal. Who cares how I feel or the structure of my diet or my hunger levels? Listen, I'm just going to hit these numbers and I'm going to get that fat loss and we're good to go. But if I'm asking you, hey, I would like you to also write down not just carbs, fat, protein, but how many fruits and vegetables you're eating, how much water you're consuming, and how do you feel after these meals? Which ones make you feel more bloated? Which ones provide sustained energy? How long after this meal do you feel like is too long to wait to train or too soon to train because your belt doesn't fit right or you're constantly farting and you're embarrassed in the gym? Never happens to me. Definitely happened to me yesterday. Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Like that stuff's important, and helping someone get an understanding of that before they jump into a goal-oriented pursuit can make that goal-oriented pursuit, when it eventually comes, far more successful. So that's been my experience, and the main thing I've struggled with is kind of the same thing you were talking about there, Steve, is communicating that in a way that doesn't make the person feel like they're not actually getting to hit go once they hire you. So Brad, you're a great coach. You work with a lot of people. You were just talking about this in the context of, water loading. How do you bridge that kind of initial friction or potential friction? Maybe you have a good way of avoiding it, where people really just want to jump into a very goal-oriented utility of tracking rather than maybe getting kind of a lay of the land.
Eric, you could not have set me up better. I mean, if you would have just went up there and put the golf ball on the tee for me, you couldn't have set it up better for me, because how many times, and we've probably all seen this, and I love it when it works out this way, but how many times does just monitoring end up getting the desired result that it is that we want? I would say, to be honest with you, and I think this is pretty darn high myself, I would say at least 33% of the time when setting up a new client to get a desired outcome, just monitoring things, just saying, I don't want you to change a thing. When you eat, I want you to just punch it into MyFitnessPal or your little Fitbit app or MacroFactor or whatever it is. I just want you to just track what you normally eat. And let's do that for 2 or 3 weeks, and then let's meet up again or have you check in or whatever. And guess what happened after those 2 or 3 weeks? They dropped a pound or two, right? A lot of times just the awareness of what it is that they're eating, and having the education that goes along with it. It's like, oh my gosh, there's protein in mushrooms. I didn't know that, And it ends up getting the desired outcome that it is that we want. They get weight loss, right? And then we can start doing these things that don't add stress really at all, because they're not doing anything different other than just punching food into this app or scanning the little scan bar, or searching it up or whatever, right? And then we can say, okay, now, since it's really not adding any stress, you haven't changed anything, I want you to tell me, how many meals have you eaten? How full are you after dinner, breakfast, etc.? We can start adding these things without adding any stress at all, instead of just kind of lumping everything on them all together. And they're already getting what it is that they want. So now there's no stress about, I need to get my desired outcome, because I'm already getting it and I haven't really changed anything. And I mean, I almost could probably beat a dead horse repeatedly on this same subject, because it's so exciting when that process illuminates the person and answers your question, Eric, is like, how do you bridge that gap? And so essentially what I do a lot of times is I will tell them exactly what it is that I just told you guys. We very well may get the outcome that we want if we press start and just have you track for these next 2 or 3 weeks. And then if it doesn't, well, hey, we're at least going to know what it is that you're, quantifiably eating as calories, but it's no skin off your teeth. It's 3 weeks, there's 52 weeks in a year. And then we can kind of start plugging in goal targets as far as calories go and things like that. And so to give an example, if I could elaborate, so my son, 21 years old, got up to this huge 250 pounds for football season, right? And he didn't like how he looked, basically. And there's no reason to be, he's 6 foot tall. There's no reason to be 250 pounds. And so he says, Daddy, I kind of want to start tracking a little bit. What do I do here? Never done it before in his entire life, right? He just started tracking, scanning stuff. He's searching stuff up. I doubt that 50% of the stuff that he's tracking is even accurate. You know what I mean? Because you were talking earlier, Eric, about, do I weigh my food cooked? Well, do I weigh it raw? Or, do I spray? Do I air fry? Do I, et cetera? He wouldn't do any of that. He was just punching numbers in. Mom cooked a bunch of meat. He would weigh it out, put it in he just monitored it for a while. He's like, Dad, you know what? I'm eating 3,200 calories every day. And I says, okay, son, you know what? Just put a cap on that, just stop at 2,500. So I started doing that, weight starts coming down. He doesn't even really think about if he's accurate or not. He doesn't think about how much weight he's losing. Lo and behold, he cuts 20, 25 pounds, I think, in about like 3-4 months, and he wasn't even trying. He's like, oh, look it. I just learned that. That's where I got that from. There's protein in mushrooms. I mean, and I mean, that is such a it's kind of like I got to see firsthand in real life in front of me and my son what I suspect has happened all along when we get this desired outcome from just simply investigating, So anyway, like I said, I could go on and on and on about that, but it's pretty exciting when that kind of thing, it's like the outcome comes from the process.
I agree with everything you said. The only thing I would disagree with is, for me, I think it's about what I've seen, 34% versus 33% of people. But no,
sorry,
that's
my
just my
quantifiable brain.
estimation.
I got to
And,
make it
I'm sure there's some variation,
1/3, right?
No,
So
but
I
in all
guess it should be
seriousness, 100%, dude.
33.33%.
Not even 34%. That's right. Yeah. Absolutely. I think it is a fallacy that is often made that, measuring something doesn't actually change it. It does, and that's what makes my job as a scientist hard, many times, is because once you start asking people to track their nutrition or track their training or even interrogate their own feelings or thoughts, those feelings, thoughts, training and nutrition and behaviors change often. And we have data on this. You can find a few different systematic reviews and meta-analyses that have been done over the years looking at mindfulness as an intervention for weight loss or managing health behaviors. And all mindfulness is, in a technical sense, is bringing attention to something intentionally that you're doing. So mindfulness interventions related to weight loss are typically noticing and being present and not being distracted while eating, and thinking about how eating makes you feel. And that often independently, at least in the short term, results in some type of weight loss, and sometimes results in behavior change and better adherence to health behaviors. And in a real practical sense, like when you wake up every day, you probably have some basic plan of what your day of eating is going to look like. If we just take a stock standard person who's not in the bodybuilding world, they're probably going to grab some cereal and some milk out of their cupboard and fridge, eat that, go to work. They're going to take a break and go to one of the local places around where they work to get lunch, or maybe bring a bag lunch, or maybe eat lunch with friends. They know roughly when that's going to happen because they have a lunch break. And they're going to get home and they're going to go, what do we have in the fridge to eat? Or maybe we have a plan, or what do we feel like going out to eat? And then if they're still hungry, they're going to have a snack at night, right? That is a loose plan. Now, on top of that, there might be someone who brought in donuts to work, right? Or you realize you didn't have enough food for dinner, so you go to Costco, and man, they've got like 5 different little appetizer taster plates all around this place. Let me have those, right? Or if you got kids, they're eating some of your food, you're eating some of theirs. It's not going the way you expect, et cetera, et cetera. Or your partner goes, you know what, I'm really thinking I want Chinese buffet tonight. And you're like, okay, sure. I'm actually not that hungry, but you know what? I always find myself eating more than intended when I go there. So these things happen. But as soon as you start tracking that, just monitoring it, not with the intention to change it, you start doing things a little differently. If you have to actually write down or think about or monitor the fact that you're having a donut at work, or that you're stopping at 5 different tasting stations, or that you're going for the second helping in that Chinese buffet, you might decide, it's not even out of a shame or a guilt thing, right, that I shouldn't have that, but you might just be aware enough of the behavior to go, oh, do I really want that? Do I really need that? So 100%, I think that does happen. And I would love to hear, Steve, from you, your thoughts on this. How do behaviors change just from tracking them? And is that even a bad thing? Or do you see that as kind of a feature, not a bug?
Absolutely. First thing, listening to these different examples, like I have a client right now, we're trying to taper away from tracking. And what we're having her do on her non-tracking days is, along with tracking her fruits, veggies, and protein, just track how many calories she's eating from like desserts or sweets. And like, of course, that's a loose label. There's a lot of things that could fall under that, but she's pretty common sense about things and can sort through stuff. And like, that's working really well, because like we've noticed with her, like she only goes over her calorie intake from like sweets, like cookies and cakes and brownies and things like that. So it's like, versus her having to do like full tracking on her high days, it's like, as long as she keeps track of her fruits, veggies, protein, and records how many calories she's consuming from sweets, like that is enough to keep her within range to keep her body comp where we want it. And it's interesting because like she has no goal for like that, like to stay under this many calories from sweets. It's like you said, it's literally just track it. Just track how many calories you're consuming from sweets with no goal. And she's found, yeah, it's helped a ton because everything you do, you have to, especially like my favorite way to have people track is to track before you actually eat something. That way tracking serves as a gatekeeper, because I think sometimes people can get into the habit of let me eat the food and then track it. But at that point, it's too late. But if somebody develops the habit where let me track before I eat something, this way I then have to decide if it is worth tracking, or they have to then get conscious about the eating process before they actually eat. That can be a big game changer for a lot of people. It's just shifting when they track their food. So yeah, absolutely, I see it change behavior all the time. And to Brad's point, if somebody has never tracked before, I mean, depending on their personality and their nutritional knowledge and how motivated they are to lose weight, like their tracking, to his point, they can be nowhere near accurate, like not even close. You know, I like look at them, it's like, I know they're eating at least 1,500 more calories than they say they're eating, but like we're still losing weight, and like it's just like it's enough to at least change behaviors and create a deficit, even though it's not even close to accurate. It's like accurate enough. And of course, it depends on someone's margin for error and how many calories they need to eat to lose weight and all those things. But it's still pretty cool seeing that, like, depending on where somebody's at, just tracking things like that can make a big difference. So, yep, see it all the time, and it's always cool when it happens.
I had to just recently kind of reverse engineer exactly what you said, Steve, because as we all know, I'm currently dieting to make weight for a powerlifting competition, and I got a really good question on one of my YouTube blogs because I decided that I was going to not track raw vegetables anymore, and they kind of said, well, how come you're not tracking your raw vegetables anymore? Is it, the micronutrients, and, are you trying to, have a desired outcome? And essentially I did want a desired outcome, but what I found is that I was not eating my fruits and vegetables because I would rather get the carbohydrate from something else. And in my specific case, it was because I wanted to have something sweet, or I wanted to have, the Cliff Bar that I just ate, you know what I mean? And so I would forego having my vegetables and my fruits so that I could get the carbohydrates from other sources, right? Not a healthy thing at all. Luckily, I had the wherewithal and the awareness to kind of recognize this. And I came to the conclusion that basically it's like, you know what? Look at the amount of calories and carbohydrates that are in just raw carrots, raw cauliflower, just raw edamame, things like this. Is it really worth even tracking that if you're just going to let it go altogether in order to have these over here? So I never even changed my caloric target. I left my caloric target alone, and I framed it in my mind as a diet break. Okay, you're going to keep your caloric target in place, but you're just going to have free reign of all raw fruits, all raw vegetables, because vegetables are obviously a lot less calories than fruits, right? And as long as it's a small amount of fruit, say 5 strawberries, couple pieces of melon or something like that, you won't track that either. And you get all the raw vegetables that you want, basically. Well, wouldn't you know it? I mean, yes, that was added calories, right? Obviously, my caloric target went up a little bit, but the outcome was I started feeling better because now I'm getting my micronutrients and I'm not eating like a child, right? Probably getting my fiber in. And I basically lost weight. I didn't lose like a ton of weight, but just lo and behold, after about 2 weeks of doing this, I saw a 163.5 on the scale. I hadn't seen 163s a long time. And so it was a nice visual representation of basically letting go of predisposed, what do I want to say? I was letting go of something that I was quantifying in my mind as a negative, right? But in actuality, it was not real. I was looking too much, and this is just my nature. I'm looking too much at the numbers, right? And not at the non-quantifiable outcomes that come from a healthy habit, a healthy food choice, a healthy, non-stressful way of organizing, a healthy habit. So I hope that I'm making sense there. I'm trying to put into words what I feel like was the outcome from that. You know what I mean?
To me, it just sounds like you set up a system that made it easier to follow behaviors that were conducive to your goal. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about this. Instead of using it as a tool to get to a very, very specific outcome.
Exactly.
I sometimes think of manipulating your environment and the behaviors you're doing to result in a incentivization of what you're trying to accomplish, right? So as an example with your client, Steve, you're not saying don't eat sweets, right? You're not creating a restriction of how many sweets she's eating. You're going, oh, I notice that it is sweets that are driving up your calorie intake and becoming a barrier to your outcome. So let's track sweets. And that mindfulness to it, that awareness of it, resulted in a behavior change. You weren't saying eat less sweets. You were creating an environment that made it less likely that you would overeat on sweets. Brad, you weren't saying calories don't matter and I can eat an unlimited amount of vegetables. And you also weren't telling yourself, hey, you can't eat sweets anymore either. You were noticing that because you had a quantitative limit, you were changing the quality of your diet in a way that was incongruent with your goals because you were displacing your vegetables with sweets. And it's actually two very similar situations, but two different outcomes based upon the personality of the individual. One person is eating sweets, it's driving their calories up too high. One person, more numbers focused, more experienced, and more focused on needing to achieve the goal of making weight for a competition, because they also want to eat sweets, is removing useful nutrients from their diet and more satiating foods like fruits and vegetables. And in each case, you both did something that was making it easier to achieve those outcomes, right? Brad, you went, right. So I have enough time to lose weight a little slower. I also could use a diet break. And how much are my calories really going to go up from, fruit and vegetable consumption? And also, it's probably good that I'm eating fruits and vegetables. So how about I do X, Y, and Z, just like Steve did with their client? And I think that's a level of utility for tracking behaviors more broadly and monitoring that a lot of people don't think of, because they hear tracking and they think, let me figure out what my three numbers are: protein, carbs, and fats. And they get very quantitatively focused. They get very focused on energy balance, and they're missing a lot of opportunities to kind of reverse engineer their environment. And that's why there's so many other things you could track, like a 1 to 5 scale of hunger and satiety after each meal, which we've talked about plenty of times on the podcast. Just trying to stay within a certain range for hunger after certain meals. You could even argue that time-restricted feeding is tracking. I'm tracking a time window, and I'm allowed to eat within that time window, and I'm not going to eat outside of it, right? I think there's a lot of ways to do this, and you're really only limited by your perception and your creativity. One of the ways that I'm changing the tracking guidelines in the upcoming third edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, you guys are probably familiar with the system I created where I have good, better, best, where it is protein and calories, or macros within a certain range. And I think that's a decent system, and it does teach this concept we're talking about, is that, you can modify the way you track things to result in different behaviors, or they should match your goals. But what I've been creating for the third edition is a way that kind of reverse engineers one's mindset to result in more flexibility. And that is, instead of having this good, better, best system, is saying, okay, what's a minimum appropriate intake of carbs, fat, and protein? And I really do mean minimum, So like in different situations, maybe gaining or cutting, I think you could have a different functional minimum for fat intake. During, let's say, a really hardcore digging phase of contest prep, your minimum for fat is basically like, I don't want to acutely have, like gallbladder stones, right? You like, I don't want to not be able to transport fat soluble vitamins, right? I want to get enough essential fatty acids. And there's nothing wrong with your protein intake for a 3 or 4 week, your fat intake for a 3 to 4 week period or something like that, being 20 to 30 grams a day in that context. But absolutely, if you have someone who's dieting or who's like trying to put on muscle mass or who's just trying to eat healthier, no, you probably want to be at least twice that for most people, right? And we look at, what intakes are associated with, normal hormone levels in both men and women, testosterone and estrogen. Now we're going, okay, maybe we should at least be consuming 40 to 50 to 60 grams a day for the average calorie intake. So anyway, in the third edition of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, I have a minimum intake in different conditions for fat, carbs, and protein. And then a calorie target, right? So this allows someone to just follow the diet the way they want to, so long as they're hitting these minimums. So that you can end up, if you hit the 3 minimums, which again aligns with probably where your default diet would be, you might only be at 1,300 calories. But your target calories, depending upon body size, whether you're losing fat, your energy expenditure, is going to be anywhere from 400 to probably 1,400 calories higher than that for most people. So that means you could choose to eat more protein, more carbs, more fats. You could fill it up with fruits and vegetables. It gives you a ton more flexibility, even in the system I created in the second edition of going, right, you can, switch down from good to best to better. So that's the type of system where you can create basically the behaviors you want by setting up different constraints. And constraints don't necessarily need to be restrictive or framed that way. And I think I really like how both of you achieved some level of restraint, right? You achieved the outcome of having someone eat less sweets or still be in a deficit without sacrificing nutrient quality, without actually saying, don't do this or don't do that, which I think is really important.
Yeah, that's fascinating insight, Eric, into the third edition. You I think you mistakenly said second edition, but we got to make sure third edition, and make a nice plug for that right now, of the Muscle and Strength Nutrition Pyramids.
Right. I probably said many things wrong.
What are some different things or different behaviors that you guys have had clients or even yourselves track, like outside of the typical like calories or carbs, fat, protein? Like, I don't know, I've just thought about like just some of the different things that like you said, Eric, like you're only limited by your creativity and limited by just thinking about your own situation and what is your barrier to your goal. So it's like I know me, I've had people track hydration status throughout the day. So It's like they'll use that new fluid intake, that new urine color chart that we give all of our athletes now. And they'll just track like, where is my hydration from, I think it's like a 1 to a 7 scale throughout the day each time they take a urination, ignoring the first one in the morning, but everyone after that. And then if I notice it around training, it's showing that they're slightly dehydrated, then like there could be a benefit from changing their habits to increase their hydration status when they train. So, and I this is a little side point, I kind of like that system a little better, because like I don't do a lot of like water cuts for meats like Brad was talking about. So I don't necessarily have to worry about like, how can I modify somebody's exact intake to get that outcome. It's more of like, how can I make sure that they're hydrated? And it's just, for me, it's easier because like everything, you guys all know this, like everything except alcohol basically counts towards hydration. So stuff with caffeine, diet sodas, fruits, vegetables, foods, like all that stuff contributes to hydration status. So for me, it's like if I have somebody track to get an idea of where their hydration's at, I have them track their urine color versus tracking their amount versus their water intake, because they might be consuming a lot of other fluids that aren't water that are contributing to their hydration status. Anyway, that was a little side point, but I've had people track alcohol intake, people who've noticed that they're just drinking too much. And it's like you said, Eric, it's like, I love not giving somebody a hard guideline, because it just, I don't know, then there's like this pressure and it creates this like, well, now you told me I can only have 2, so now I definitely want more than 2. where if you just like keep it open-ended and say, hey, you can still literally have as much as you want. All you have to do is track it. It's just amazing how much that changes behavior. So hydration status, alcohol, saturated fat intake, fiber, fruits, vegetables, sweets. Those are probably my 6 most common, like non-traditional, like carbs, fats, protein, calories. I'm trying to think if I'm missing anything else, but those, yeah, I would say those are probably my top ones. Do you guys, is there any other things that you guys or even yourselves track, that are unique?
Brad, you want to start or you want me to go?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. The only addition to that would be sodium, and with us, it's because we work with bodybuilders, and it kind of somewhat crosses over into powerlifting, not nearly as prevalently, but a good example of not putting pressure on somebody to track something new. Whenever you're tracking your food in an app, it's almost always going to track your sodium for you. You know what I mean? And so a lot of times, if I want an idea of what a person's sodium is, but I don't want to put the pressure on them of paying attention to it, I will just simply hold a quick little Zoom interview, Skype interview, Google Meets interview, and I'll say, okay, I want you to open up your tracking app. I want you to go back to April 16th and tell me what your sodium is. And I will just log it. You know what I mean? I'm not even going to say track. I just log what their sodium is. You know what I mean? And then I always take an average of it, because it's not, we don't live in these bubbles to where it's like always the same number, 1.1 grams, 1.1 grams, et cetera. I just take it all and then average it out. And then I get, what I want to have their sodium to be based on what it is that they've been taking in. Right. So yeah, tracking sodium, or like I said, better yet, just you tell me what your sodium is that you didn't even know you were taking in, And then usually I'll ask them, okay, you know what? Are you putting some salt on your food? Okay, well, a couple shakes here, a couple shakes there, quarter of a teaspoon, we're looking at some milligrams there, right? And then I'll usually kind of throw that in there. Totally different from having, a desired outcome there. I'm just like we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, I'm trying to get a baseline through monitoring, which they didn't know that they, were doing anyway. Sometimes that's useful for people with hypertension, Let's just see, where is your sodium right now? Instead of the doctor just saying, okay, I want you to eat a low sodium diet. Well, great. But what if the person's taking in 9 grams of sodium every day? They start taking in a low sodium diet, they might start passing out from hypotension. You know what I mean? We got to kind of find out where they're at before we can just randomly assign, okay, put 150 kilos on the bar on your next squat session. You know what I mean? You could probably take that person that's taking 9 grams of sodium every single day, simply cut that down by 33.5, or there I go again with my cut it down by 1/3.
1/3,
right?
Yeah.
And get the desired outcome that you're after there, right? And so yeah, sometimes I find it useful for people that have, hypertension or something like that. People are always asking me, Brad, why do you track your saturated fat? What significance does that have in either your bodybuilding or your lifting performance? Well, it's got nothing to do with either of that. You know what I mean? I have a cardiac condition. I've got some arteriosclerosis in my left anterior descending artery. That's the main artery that goes down the front of your heart that feeds all the blood to your heart. And I just want to make sure that my LDL, the low density lipoprotein, it stays low. And we all know, well, most people don't know. I learned this from Sigma Nutrition, plug to those guys over there. But saturated fat is basically the direct correlation to your level of low density lipoprotein. So I track mine to keep it low, not all the time. I should probably make that little transparent disclaimer. I track it every now and then I get away from it. I kind of track it, make sure I'm establishing a habit of, eating lower saturated fats, kind of get that ingrained in my mind, and then I get away from it for a while, and then I just kind of audit it every now and then. But just to make a long story short, I will sometimes track my saturated fat only because I've got this cardiac condition and I want to make sure that I'm not contributing to making it worse. So I think those are really the only two things off the top of my head, except I want to just plug that hydration status on the urine color. to me, that's been a game changer personally, because I've injured myself so many times being dehydrated because I was thinking to myself, how much water do I need to drink, instead of just simply monitoring what my urine is. Because like you said, Steve, sometimes when you take some alcohol, the night before, it kind of dehydrates you a little bit. And so sure, you might get in your normal 32 ounces, 40 ounces, whatever water, that you get in, but that's not going to make your urine color the way that we want it to look before you start performing. You know what I mean? Maybe you didn't drink enough water the night before and 32 ounces doesn't cut it. I love that way of monitoring your hydration through urine color. So I wanted to plug that and give you guys, as our science people, the props for exposing that to me.
Yeah, just to echo that, the beauty of looking at the outcome is that you don't have to make assumptions about changes in the water balance, right? And I think that there's parallels to that and other things. That's kind of the basic way that all of this started. We're looking at changes in body weight, and then we're looking at our energy intake. And like you were talking about with Xander, he's wildly off, his tracking. We don't actually know his energy expenditure, but we can assess the utility of that practice by whether or not the outcome is doing what we want. Yeah. And Steve, to answer your question, a lot of the things that I have people track, I think about what drives overconsumption and what leads to underconsumption. It's kind of the old school model of our understanding of energy balance is, okay, if we do know that it is, in simple terms, calories in, calories out, then we just tell people to eat less and move more. Yet that clearly doesn't work. So if people aren't intentionally eating more and moving less and they're gaining weight, how can we get them to unintentionally move more and eat less? And those are things that I often track, because as we discussed, when you start tracking something and you bring mindfulness to it, that behavior can often change without actually asking them to change the behavior. So there's some really good papers that people should check out. There's one by Hall and colleagues, The Energy Balance Model of Obesity, Beyond Calories In, Calories Out. And there's another one by Blundell and Beaulieu, The Complex Pattern of the Effects of Prolonged Frequent Exercise on Appetite Control and Implications for Obesity. The reason why I love these is they specifically speak to what happens more or less, quote unquote, spontaneously to people's body weight and their energy intake when you start just modifying things like this. So another thing that is not directly related to nutrition is step count. And just like we don't have someone track their macros in all cases after the initial learning phase, you don't have to keep tracking your step count. You get someone to turn that functionality on their phone, or maybe they do have some type of tracking device, and you get an idea of what their step count is for over a couple of weeks on average. And then you go, okay, what things can we do to make it easier to get a higher step count? Do we need to be driving everywhere? Are there ways or things that we can incorporate that don't just feel like, oh, I have to stop what I'm doing and go take a walk, that can result in us having more time and more steps? Like, okay, do you regularly listen to podcasts? Okay, why don't we do that while walking? Since you're not really doing anything else while you're doing that. Or do we need to be parking at the same distance? Or can we take the stairs, et cetera, et cetera? There's a lot of ways to do it. But I try to shift their step count up to a reasonable level that's no longer sedentary, because we know that being sedentary dysregulates hunger and results in greater passive energy consumption and body weight going up. So just like some people, when they're underhydrated, also tend to eat more, which has been observed, or if they have low nutrient density in their diet, they might eat more in other places. You can start tracking those things as well. So fruit, vegetables, hydration status based upon urine, hitting a certain amount of steps, and then making a minimum intake of the macronutrients. Those are the big ones I focus on. Other ones I like to do, Steve, as well, is just satiety levels post-meal, and then having the person note down the quality of the meal. Like, what am I actually eating? So the foods themselves actually taking some level of importance, especially in that initial learning phase where people are just trying to get a kind of a lay of the land. What I want to do is maximize adherence to whatever approach we take. And when someone just starts with, right, I need to hit 150 grams of carbs, 60 grams of fat, and 175 grams of protein, they're more likely to jettison their entire current diet and just totally change it, which isn't necessarily bad, but it sometimes makes for changes that they're just like kind of gritting their teeth and bearing it. Like, I really don't like X, Y, and Z food, but I don't know other ways to hit my targets. So some of the things that I really like to do are to have them actually go over what their current nutrition is and think of substitutions. What are ways that I can not really change my diet, but change my diet? A really obvious one with General Pop is, I like to drink a can of Coke at night. Can we do Coke Zero? We do Diet Coke. And it feels exactly the same, but you've just cut 150 calories out of your diet, right? And similar parallels exist with low-fat dairy, low-fat cheese, lower carbohydrate or non-nutritive sweetener things, or even just smaller portion sizes, but still getting wraps, but getting a higher fiber, smaller wrap. Switching from chicken thighs to chicken breasts, you name it. There's a ton of things that I could give as examples, but this ensures that you're not disliking what you're doing, and you're rather just trying to follow something that feels quite similar, resulting in the outcome you want. And the key to that, you can't make those modifications until you first know and track what you're doing. So I think actual meal structure and the actual meal placement as well, I think, is important. And all of those things together don't need to be implemented at once. I think you can have somebody do these in incremental steps, or just based upon what do we think is the friction that is preventing them from getting where they want to be. So it's sort of reverse engineering like the obesity epidemic, right? So how did we get here, right? Why are people passively gaining weight? Because they're not trying to gain weight. So we know that trying to eat less and move more is a poor outcome, like probability. It's only 10-15% of people who can do that consistently. And even the ones who do it, we find out it's actually they're doing some monitoring behaviors and things that enable them to kind of keep track of things. So, all right, how do we modify your environment, your lifestyle, and how do we tweak what you're currently doing? And what do we need to track to tweak what you're doing to result in these changes in energy expenditure and energy intake? Because it's just saying don't do that or do this is not always going to be successful, or it has basically it's a time limit, before the effort you're putting forth starts to be too challenging to continue doing it, or it's easy to knock those behaviors kind of off because they are taking consistent effort and restraint. And while restraint probably does need to be in there at some point and for some goals, the idea is to, how do we get all this low-hanging fruit first, no pun intended, before then we start actually leveraging your the restraint needed. And when you do finally go, right, we need to eat less on purpose and we're going to be hungry, or you need to spend time out of your day doing cardio that you wouldn't otherwise do, and as soon as the goal is achieved, you're not going to keep doing. We want that to go further. I think the problem we have with many people is that because they don't have the tracking skills, because they don't know what their current activity levels are, because they're so inaccurate and they haven't made all these blunders with tracking that people are inevitably going to make in the first month or so, that they put forth all this effort to do these things, but they do it poorly because they don't have the skills, and they get a bad outcome, and then it's really discouraging and it damages their self-efficacy. But if you start them just monitoring and being mindful and going, right, where can we fit in these things? And it's a learning process. You don't have that experience. And all of those quote unquote blunders are now actually no longer barriers. They're not stumbling blocks. They're stepping stones to your learning, so that when you do actually decide to implement a deficit and start doing cardio, now all of a sudden you're getting a far higher return on investment, and you're much more likely to achieve your goals. And you're rewarded for your efforts rather than discouraged by how much effort you put in with so little return coming back. And the idea there is that before you launch off a launch pad and try for some big, hairy, audacious goal, you're shooting for the stars, hoping to hit the moon, you probably actually want a foundation, right? Instead of just to have this thing crumble underneath you as you turn the jets on. So you're building some nutrition fundamentals for the person for whatever goal they decide to achieve. And I think that's a concept that is often missed in our industry. People start engaging with nutrition information because they want to change right now, and they don't get the fundamentals. So I think, yeah, very long-winded answer to your question of, so what are the things you have people track, Eric? And I could have been like, hunger, step count, and then just shut up. But as I often do, I said a lot more.
You said a lot of good things.
And I have to kind of piggyback on what you said, Eric, because I want to make sure that I want to note how creative people can be when you use like kind of a positive motivation instead of a negative motivation. You brought this up, and it's a very good point. Instead of saying, don't do this or do that, right? People get very creative when you say, okay, how can we increase our step count? How can we cut down on the sugar that you take in, right? And I just comedy relief here, because I want to just give you guys an idea of the creativity of people when you give them control. When you ask these kind of questions, and you give them the control, you give them the reins, so to speak, the creativity is it's not only humorous, but it's also very, very effective. So for example, how can we get your step count out? 3 weeks later, Brad, my house has never been so clean. I'm vacuuming my house 3 times a week now, and got the steps up, and now they got a cleaner house. I mean, I didn't tell them to do that, but that was their way of increasing their step count. Another a gentleman, I am no longer bringing all of the groceries in one trip. I take purposely several trips, one bag at a time, to get the groceries in the house. You know what I mean? You name it. It's like mowing the lawn. I fired the landscaper so that I can mow the lawn and do this kind of stuff. When you give them the control, the creativity that comes out of people sometimes to get what it is that we're after is sometimes just mind-boggling to me. Steve's nodding. I'm assuming that.
I didn't know if you were done. I didn't want to cut you off. I didn't want to cut you off. And Eric, you probably know the term on this, but I think it's called moving towards and moving away from goals. I'm not sure if that's what it's called in the research, but that's what I've always learned it as. It's like there's moving towards goals and moving away from goals. And so it's like, I always try to set moving towards goals whenever possible, just because it seems more positive. And to your point, Brad, if they can be involved in that goal setting process, it's always way better, because it's way better to feel like I was a part of setting this goal versus somebody just gave me this thing that I have to go do. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I think those are both good highlights and important things when it comes to trying to decide what to track.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of got a little bit on a tangent there, but I had to just bring that up when Eric was talking about the power of giving asking the questions of how we can make this happen.
And you described it perfectly well, Steve. In the literature, they just call them approach versus avoidance goals. So moving towards versus moving away is exactly what those terms mean. And the idea would be, instead of trying to eat fewer sweets, you would try to eat more vegetables, knowing that the vegetables will probably displace some of your other calories, right? And there's a lot of research on this, actually, and they're pretty consistent findings that approach-oriented goals are far more likely to result in the outcomes we want. And there's connections to other areas of research on this as well. So, for example, perfectionism is a trait that is very common in athletes and successful people, but it's also very common in burnout and overtraining in athletes. And there are 2 different ways of quantifying in a personality questionnaire types of perfectionism. So there's both facilitative and non-facilitative perfectionism, and one is based upon fear. So fear of falling short, basically. When perfectionism is motivated by that, it tends to result in higher indices of overtraining, burnout, and dissatisfaction among athletes. However, perfectionism as approaching the goal of excellence is another way of framing it. That tends to not have negative outcomes, and it tends to be associated with athlete success. So it's It's not the fear of falling short. It's not that you're trying to cover up your perceived insecurities or you're worried about the downsides of not being perfect. You're seeing striving for perfection, and that's actually what it's called, perfectionist striving, is kind of a cost-free, at least it's neutral in most research, as a method of trying to do very hard things. So very similar to kind of approach versus avoidance-oriented goals. So it is really, how do you set yourself up for success without a potential for failing, right? When you're trying to eat more vegetables and you eat a little bit more versus not a lot more, you're not going, I screwed up when I ate sweets. It's like, I could do better on this, right? I could try to get this, improve this. And a huge part of this is because it's related to autonomy, which is what you were getting at, Brad. When we think about how human motivation works, and we also just think about the logistics of online coaching, which is what 90% of fitness and nutrition coaching looks like these days, there are certain issues with being really kind of top-down and prescriptive in your approach. We're limited by our creativity, right? The experiences we have with other clients, not this client who's new with us, this hypothetical, or our own personal experience, right? We're thinking about, okay, well, what would I track? And Steve's asking, Eric, Brad, what other things do you track in addition to me? And we only came up with a small list. But when you start asking the client, hey, how would you get to this? Like, what do you think is the barrier in your life? I'm not with you when you go to the grocery store. I don't know how long your commutes are. I don't know how stressful it is when you come home from work. I don't know, how many kids you're dropping off for soccer practice, whatever, right? I don't understand your gym environment or how much time you have. All of these things we might have an idea of, but they're the reality for the client. And if we ask them, what can we do to get to this outcome? The creativity will get leveraged because they're actually the ones seeing the problem. And we're just helping them go, right, let's come together. Here's, with my expertise, I can tell you that these are the things that tend to lead towards passive overconsumption or low energy expenditure, which can be not great for your satiety regulation. So what can we do to get to those outcomes? How do you think you can reverse engineer your environment? Or which variables do you think, if you were more mindful of, or if you tracked, that might end up being a reduction in friction or more likely lead you to the behavior we're trying to achieve? And lo and behold, human motivation, based upon our best explanatory theory of self-determination theory, we've got this thing called autonomy, which is central to it, which is saying, hey, you're much more likely to succeed and feel fulfilled and find meaning when you're in charge of your own goals. Not me coming in there saying, here, I want you to track this, but me coming in and saying, hey, I've had some success with people tracking this for this reason. What might that look like in your life? You tell me, right? And that fits really well with the construct of being a coach who is not living with our clients. I mean, even when I was a personal trainer, you're only seeing them in person in the environment of the gym 2 to 3 hours per week. And when I got really creative, maybe I would schedule going to the grocery store with them. And that would be our session for the day. Or sitting down and looking at some nutrition labels with them. It's kind of like this kind of on-the-job nutrition training. And that's great, but it is still only a snapshot of their day. So I think, no, Brad, that's an excellent point in that you want to leverage the creativity of the person because they're the one in the trenches in their own lives. No matter how much experience we have as coaches, it's never going to be as specific as the knowledge of the person who's living that life, which they're trying to change, for sure.
Yeah, that was pretty rich right there, Eric. I almost feel like that could almost be its own little clip that we put on how to succeed.
Hey, there we go. Social media.
It's interesting. I like where this has gone because it started off with kind of like, hey, like, here are the different reasons you can track just to modify behavior, to actually change behavior to achieve an outcome. And then we've gone through like, okay, here are some of the different things you can track that are some of the non-traditional things. And now it's shifted into, okay, well, how should you choose what to track and how should you frame the things that you're tracking? Because it reminds me, a few years ago, I was working with someone and they had worked with other coaches and done other programs, but for some reason, like when they had a calorie, whenever they had a calorie goal previously, it always felt like such a restriction. They felt like they were being limited. Every time they were given a calorie goal, it felt like a very negative thing. where like we were able to reframe that to where it didn't feel like a restriction anymore, but it felt like they were something they were working towards to achieve. So it's just interesting because it was the same thing. Like at the end of the day, it was still a calorie limitation, but like in their mind, we were able to reframe like it was not something that you had to limit yourself towards, but it's actually just another goal that you're working to achieve. And I don't know, it's just the psychology behind, because that's where everyone varies, and I don't want to go too far off the path here, but like, you know, it's like for some people, tracking actually makes them worse at something, where it's like this is common in people who are trying to stay too lean. Like by having them track their steps, that it encourages them, that makes them want to keep having these really high step counts. Or if somebody is again, it simply tends to be people who are trying to stay too lean. If they're tracking their calorie intake, they're limiting and keeping their body fat at a level that is not at a good place to live at long-term, health-wise and performance-wise. So it's just interesting how some people, tracking can be a very beneficial thing that increases awareness and creates new behavior, but for other people, tracking actually then becomes a detriment and perpetuates behaviors that are going against their health or their goals. And Eric, I think that's one of the things that stimulated us to create that transition away from tracking, was like there was that whole section like, hey, there's actually negative outcomes if you're tracking the wrong things at the wrong time. And more tracking is not always better. And tracking, you know, what you don't always have to track certain things. It just, what you were talking about there just made me think of all that stuff.
No, and actually I think that's a good maybe final topic for this podcast, is acknowledging that what you track, when you track, and for what reason is one variable, but who you are is another variable, right? And we struggle with this because we're, you know, heavily biased by our own experiences and perceptions and perspectives to think of what it would be like to be a totally different person. But there are many clients who get a sense of security, safety, rhythm, routine, and consistency from tracking their nutrition, even if, like, you know, in the off season. You know, I'm not trying to hit a deficit. I'm not trying to modify it, but, you know, I want to make sure I'm in the 3,400 to 3,600 calorie range. Let's say an off season male bodybuilder. Okay, I'm slowly gaining weight. Great. And in prep, I also like to track. But there's other athletes who are like, listen, I want to track as little as possible in the off season because I was so stressed from doing it during prep. And there's some athletes during prep who, like, I couldn't imagine doing what you or Berto would do at not tracking. And even maybe they still have the skills to track and eyeball and not actually, like, you know, if they lost internet access for a day, they wouldn't go off the rails. They just prefer to have it all quantified, you know, almost kind of more of an OCD behavior, rather than I only know how to operate with this tracking software. And it goes beyond that. Outside of contest prep, you know, like, the same behaviors can either be useful ways of maintaining weight loss. If we look at the National Weight Control Registry, we see that one of the prevalent behaviors among people who have successfully lost at least 5% of their body weight and kept it off for a year or longer is some type, and probably fitting into the whole umbrella of everything we've talked about, of monitoring and tracking behaviors, either stepping on the scale occasionally, or, you know, looking at their water intake, or tracking their steps, or tracking their actual calorie intake, or maybe their protein, or something like that. That behavior is pretty consistently associated with successful weight loss maintainers. However, if we look at, there's a study by Levinson and colleagues, and they found that 75% of people with eating disorders, I think binge eating disorder specifically, use MyFitnessPal or some other tracking device. And of those 75%, the vast majority of them, another 75%, felt that it contributed negatively towards their eating disorder symptoms. So you think, oh shit, well, maybe we shouldn't have people tracking at all. Well, actually, not necessarily. That's probably a moderator, as we call it in the research, not an actual causational factor, because there's yet other research where you experimentally ask people to start tracking, and we don't see harm necessarily. There's a study by Hahn and colleagues, and it's not the only one, introducing dietary self-monitoring to undergraduate women via calorie counting app has no effect on mental health or health behaviors. Results from a randomized controlled trial. And the title says it all. But the important thing to remember is that in this study, what did they first do? They screened to see if anyone had a high score on a eating disorder inventory. And if you did, they didn't include you in the study because they didn't want to introduce potential for harm. So if someone does not have a predisposition or an existing eating disorder or disordered eating patterns, just simply tracking, again, to monitor, not necessarily tracking to lose weight, there's not going to be any expected harm based upon the data we have. But at the same time, we have to accept that in a totally different population, people with eating disorders, it's part and parcel of their symptoms in many cases. So those aren't the same. And I think, our transitioning away from tracking course, it starts in the introduction with, hey, if tracking has some negative features for you, here's how we can keep the positive features of it while trying to let go of some of those negative features, or as many of them as possible. Here's why you might want to do that. Here's what the experience might be if you think it's worth doing that. And here's the process. And here's some other things you can track, like satiety and hunger, or just looking at body weight, et cetera, et cetera. And the same thing is true of, say, monitoring body weight. I think that's another one that we haven't really discussed, is you can...
Yeah, true.
A very common thing that I like to do in the off season with athletes is get them away from tracking their calorie intake, and really just minimize the number of nutrition variables they track just to keep them on point. Like you talked about, Steve, like hydration, fruit and vegetables, protein, maybe, okay, good. We got those big rocks in place. Or you could take the, third edition pyramid approach, minimum intakes, and then you stop tracking after that. And then you just look at rate of weight gain. And then you go, all right, what's the fewest number of times I need to step on the scale per week? Let's say 3. And to get an average, and I look at that over every 2 or 3 week period. And now you've reduced the tracking a whole lot, and maybe that's beneficial for the person, and you're seeing, okay, am I reaching my target outcome? And if not, I could do other things. You can also just track your hunger and satiety levels and look at that in relation to change in body weight over time and be more or less satiated depending upon what your goal is. That is something I do pretty frequently with people, is just kind of have them quantify post-meal satiety and to go, what should it be at? Or pre-meal satiety, like how hungry should you be before you sit down to eat? And in a cut, you're probably gonna be ready to eat, In a bulk, you could eat, and it's about time, but it maybe doesn't necessarily, it's not a strong motivating factor. And after you're done eating, you feel full. But during a cut, you just don't feel hungry anymore, right? And then if that is or isn't getting you to your weight gain goal, then we can try to modify hunger levels, or better yet, we can modify your food choices, your spacing, and all these other things related to it to make those meals more or less satiating to get to your goals. So I think there's a tremendous number of ways that you can implement this. And I think the key critical points are that you want to have someone develop all these soft skills of tracking when there's not something on the line. You want them to become a skillful, nutrition knowledgeable person who has the ability to track as needed, through various different types of things they could track, before they then are punished by doing it wrong, because not getting to their goal as fast as they could, and that becoming friction. And then the second thing you want to do is absolutely leverage the experience of the person and their knowledge of their environment to come up with creative solutions and the hows of how you want to get there. And then the third one is that before you start implementing, hit these numbers, don't eat over this calorie target, get these number of steps in, do X and don't do Y, before you start directly saying, here are limits, here's restraint, and here are some avoidance and approach goals, why don't we just try to reverse engineer our environment, track certain things, and create an awareness of other things that will result in the outcome we want, rather than prescriptively saying, do the thing we're trying to get to.
That's one thing that I can say that I've really benefited from over these last 10 years of not bodybuilding, right? I have stepped on a powerlifting platform. I've had nothing on the line is the bottom line, right? And Eric, your whole discourse that you just went through prompted a lot of things that I'll try to summarize, even though I tend to be long-winded. But with nothing on the line, I've been able to really dabble in a lot of different ways of tracking things quantifiably and non-quantifiably. And so where I'm at right now, I mean, I'm considering this to be one of my most successful preps ever, because I've got a decade of experimenting and doing the things that we've talked about with nothing on the line. It was just basically I was being my own guinea pig in my own little petri dish. And one of the things that I wanted to really quickly touch on that we didn't talk about tracking is palatability of food. And one of the things that I've played with in myself is without tracking anything at all except for my body weight, I just simply made my food bland. I just used the bare minimum of salt on my chicken, and my broccoli. I didn't use like really any cheese sauces, just very, very limited spices to just make it palatable enough. And the result was I found that I was eating less because I was not having these triggers of appetite stimulation in a way. And as a result, my body weight would go down. Now I'm sure there's other contributing factors in there because like you said, Eric, causation is not always correlation. But that's something else that I've tracked in the past in myself. And I've used with people when the tool is needed. But I've also done the exact opposite. It's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to take a diet break. And I know that with me, I tend to correlate hunger with success in fat loss and in weight loss. The more hungry I am, the more successful I am with fat loss and weight loss. And I'm sure we've all experienced that before, right? So I would just simply say, okay, Brad knows that that's the way that he usually is, and he's going to continue to probably be a little bit hungry during this diet break. I am simply going to introduce more palatable foods. I'm going to use more spices. I'm going to put a little bit of parquet butter spray on things and things like that to make it a little bit more palatable. And, I would eat more food. And a lot of times I would eat more of the healthy foods. So I don't want to drag this on longer than it needs to be, but that's one thing that occurred to me, Eric, when you were talking there, that I have tracked before and I sometimes utilize as a practitioner, with people when tracking the palatability of food. But my point is as a coach, I feel like I want people to kind of go away from this podcast with some sort of a, something that they could utilize, you know what I mean? And all I can really say is that 10 years of nothing on the line have led me to during this cut right here, I've gone through phases of not tracking anything except for just making myself a little bit hungry. Then I would kind of correlate that to, okay, now let's track a little bit while maintaining the same amount of hunger levels. And then I would correlate this amount of hunger levels results in this many calories. You know what I mean? Then I would just kind of get away from something else and I would just track the body weight for a while, right? It's all of this years and years and years, which I know people don't have years and years and years when it comes to getting to their goal, but it's kind of what you need is to have these tools when nothing is on the line in order to bring you to where, like you said, Eric, you and Berto have been, where you don't track at all, That takes a lot of experience and kind of in the trenches type of work. And so, I just wanted to kind of give people, coaching me wants to give people a takeaway here of something that they can do or something that, some actionable plan.
Just two final thoughts, and then I know close real quick. Brad, you said one thing that just reminded me of somebody I'm working with right now. So we're doing this strategy where she'll track calories for 3 weeks and then take a week off of tracking, and then track calories for 3 weeks and take a week off of tracking.
I've done that
and
too,
for her, yeah, that week off of tracking, she's like, I view it as it helps me get a gauge of what my habits and behaviors are like. It's like when I'm not tracking calories, what's going on here? Am I going way off or am I sticking to my structure? I still have her track fruits, veggies, and protein on those days, but we just take a week off of calories. And so what you said there, Brad, just reminded me of she views it as a very positive thing. It's like a test. Hey, this kind of shows me of where I'm at in terms of how well formed these habits are. And the second thing is we've said this indirectly, but just to kind of cap it with the direct statement of if I've definitely seen where there's people where when they start tracking calories, it adds a bunch of stress and they want to lose weight and they feel like they have to track I guess they've always learned or been told or read that to lose weight, you have to track calories. And so they kind of force themselves to do that. But every time they do, it adds a bunch of unnecessary stress. And I'd say, if you're in that situation and you find tracking calories adds all this stress, use some of the things that we talked about in this podcast and track more just specific behaviors, or like just your fruit and vegetable and maybe your sweet intake, or don't completely abandon tracking. You don't have to mess with calories for a while, but maybe pick a few other things that would be easier for you to track that wouldn't add that stress, but would still help you create the energy deficit. So that's my final thought.
Good wrap-ups from all three of us. I gave 3 points. Brad, you gave some actionable points from the coaching perspective. And Steve, I think I really like that, is not necessarily throwing the baby out with the bathwater, proverbially, and focusing on some things that will get you to where you want to go that don't produce stress. And again, that's a great opportunity just to think more creatively about what tracking can mean and what it can be used for. Because I vehemently believe that tracking can be used as a educational tool. Tracking to monitor, tracking to learn. It's how you learn that there is a little more protein in mushrooms than you otherwise thought, or that there's a little less protein in nuts than you otherwise thought, and a little higher calories, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I think we did a great job, team. I want to thank you both for your contributions to this podcast, because I really hope it opens up not only a sea of possibilities to those listening, but also gives them some additional structure which they can follow. Because it is one thing, like you said, Brad, to have the experience to do this sort of thing and step away from different traditional tracking methods. But it is another when you don't necessarily have that experience. And hopefully we can help fast track people without those years under their belt into being a little more intentional and knowing which tools to develop so that they can get there far more efficiently than any of us. So let me just say thank you for listening, dear listener and 3DMJers. I hope you enjoyed, and we will catch you in the next 3DMJ podcast. What's going on, everybody? Eric Helms here, Chief Science Officer of 3DMJ. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and let me just take 1 second to tell you about MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. This is a monthly research review that I do with Lauren Colenso-Semple, Eric Trexler, as well as Mike Zerdos. These are experts in their field, and we cover all the information relevant to you as an athlete or coach if you're working with strength or physique athletes, or if you're a recreational or competitive athlete yourself. We cover nutrition, training, sports psychology, and health. And we do this in written format, as well as, since you like the podcast, audio summaries, as well as video concept reviews. If you're a trainer, we also have continuing education credits for ACSM, NSCA, NASM, and ACE. So head over to 3dmusclejourney.com, click on the products tab, and you can find us there. I look forward to seeing you, and enjoy the podcast.